One. Welcome, everybody. My name is Gregory Mitchem. I am with the House of Light Center, and we today have Paul Wallis for actually the second time he's been with us. Welcome, Paul.
G'day, Gregory. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you. And Paul Wallis is a researcher, speaker, author of the international bestsellers Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden. He researches the world's ancestral narratives for how they speak to our origins as a species and a potential today as human beings. His documents are on the Fifth Kind TV and the Paul Wallis channel. He is watched by millions worldwide. Paul is also married with 3 children and lives in Australia. How's Australia, Paul?
Oh, it's pretty good right now, thanks. Moving into spring.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, we will be talking about Paul's new book, The Eating Conspiracy. You don't want to miss that. And here we go. Paul, we talked, and I would encourage anybody who has not saw the first video, because I entitled this the Paul Wallis video, video number 2, as we're going to pick up on the Elohim. For those of us who have not saw anything about the Elohim, can you just kind of cite your thoughts on that?
The Elohim is probably the oldest word in the Bible that traditionally has been translated as God. But when you go back to the root meaning and use that root meaning, it makes sense of why it's a plural form word, and it takes plural verb forms and attributives, exhibits plural behaviors. And bit by bit, you realize that you're looking at a community of powerful ones. That's what the word actually means. And if you want to get your head around why there's so much conflict and drama and trauma in the Hebrew scriptures, in what we call the Old Testament, that's the first step, to realize that you're reading about a community of advanced beings that our ancients called the powerful ones. And they were the Bible's version of the Sumerian, Anunnaki, or Sky people.
Excellent. And so for the people who don't know about anything about these Elohim, would you say that these gods were actually gods as we understand them, or are they higher beings of a more advanced civilization?
Well, the word God is, I think, a very misleading word in the English language, because if you use that word, you immediately think of some kind of holy or transcendent being. But you look at how the gods of the Greek panoply behave, you realize that you're looking at beings, and you go deeper into those stories, certainly at the local telling of them, and you realize that you're looking at flesh and blood mortal beings. So the word God, strictly speaking, doesn't occur in the Bible at all. You are looking at powerful ones and then other beings using other names and other designations. But the word gods, as we understand it, really isn't a biblical word at all. We are looking at beings who visited us, who had more advanced technology, and who therefore sort of won the esteem of our ancestors, who looked at what they could do and thought, well, these must be our superiors.
Yeah. And when we talk about these beings, this is an age-old question that I'm asking everybody who's researchers like us. Who made these beings?
Well, I hold to the theory of panspermia, which you can find beautifully expressed by Plato 2,500 years ago, or you can hear it expressed in more scientific terms by people in recent times, such as Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA, or Carl Sagan. They would argue that the genetic coding for biological intelligent life is as much a property of the cosmos as are the properties of light or of gravity. In other words, that the genetic coding for life is the norm throughout the cosmos rather than the exception. And that whenever that coding lands in an hospitable environment, meaning a planet with water, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones with which we're familiar. So really, that takes us to one end of the journey in saying all life in the cosmos is ultimately related. And it takes us back to the same source from which light emanates, from which gravity emanates, space, time. We're looking at genetic coding emerging at that same moment. So who created is really too basic or puppet masterish a kind of framework for that question. We're really looking at something far more mystifying, with light, gravity, space, space-time, genetic coding, all emerging from some primordial source. And in fact, the way Plato expressed it, he argued that the first cause, or the thing from which the whole material cosmos has emanated, was a unified field of consciousness, and that consciousness preceded the material cosmos. And so you've got intelligence, consciousness, intent, somehow preceding everything we know and see and can measure. So you find that in Plato, and you find that thought echoed in primitive Christianity, and that's the view I hold. So, people say, well, who made the visitors? It's the same source as everything in the cosmos. In fact, the Apostle Paul sort of approaches this idea in Acts chapter 17, where he has to give a definition of what he means by theos, his word for God, the Greek word, interestingly, for God. And he has to give an explanation of that to a non-religious audience. And he says, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring. And that's my God concept.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating and very well put. The interview today is going to focus on something that I think, when we start searching and we start seeing these things coming from a mystical place, certainly more esoteric, not, in your regular church function. I've done a lot of research and have found out that, and I'm sure likewise you have, that there are these things called NDEs, which are near-death experiences, and OBEs, or out-of-body experiences. And then we could probably go even further and talk about astral travel. We don't have all that time, but to me, it's piercing through the veil or dimensions. And I think we have the greatest proof. Maybe we can say proof, but if we have all of these stories by thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are very, very similar, I find that very, very interesting. And I would like you to comment on your thoughts, because when we have somebody who is, well, let's just say this, when somebody passes after they have died, what would with all your deep studies that you have done, what would you say when we have the common denominators of the light, the tunnel, the beautiful feeling of love? What is your thoughts and what's really going on?
Yes, I think anyone who's had an out-of-body experience returns with some pretty profound questions about who we are and what consciousness is. Because in an out-of-body experience, your consciousness is functioning and can see in some form other than through your physical eyes, and can hear in some form other than through your physical ears. So this is the experience of people who perhaps flatline on the operating theatre in hospital, and then when they come back, they can report a conversation that happened 2 rooms away, as their relatives were told, what had happened, that kind of thing. And they come back with all kinds of detail, meaning they were conscious, they were able to perceive things, but not through the body. Now, if you have an experience like that, or if you study them, you will rapidly come to the conclusion that we are beings of consciousness hosted by our physical bodies. And that's enough to raise the question of, so did we exist that way before the body? Do we continue to exist that way after the body? So people can come to that question that way. People who are interested in ultimate questions, or who have a religious faith, this is often a very central question. Where did we come from? Where do we go when we die? And people who've read my books, people come to my books for lots of reasons. Some because they're interested in extraterrestrials, paleo contact, the theory that our ancestors had contact with extraterrestrials. But if a Christian believer reads my books, they'll realize they're shot through with theology, and that they're asking some really fundamental questions about the shape of Christianity and how it emerged, and going back to earlier forms of Christianity that differ from what we all think is normal mainstream orthodoxy. And one of the points I make in my theological aspect to these books is that in the beginning, there was a lot of to and fro and debating and violence around the question of how to describe Jesus. And those debates often centered on his divinity. How do we express his divinity? And they spent about 3 centuries working out how to express that. And I think they got it right. But on the other hand, what got missed out was the question of how similar is Jesus to you and me, and how different is he? And the question of his uniqueness was not really properly analyzed. If you read the Bible in a bubble, you will come away with the view that Jesus' story was absolutely unique. But if, as we were saying before we came on air, Gregory, if you read Egyptian mythology, if you read Greek and Roman mythology, you'll realize that the story of Jesus fits neatly into a whole family of stories. So then when you come, for instance, to the Gospel of John, and you read the story arc of Jesus's life, you'll realize it's not the story of an individual, it's the story of all of us. That Jesus's story arc is a model of life for you and me. So the Gospel of John says that Jesus existed in some ethereal form before incarnating as a material human being. And then after this material life, he expected to return to the glory with the Father that he'd known before this material life. So you've got the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh. That's the story of all of us once you set the Gospel of John in this wider context. And then this material life, wrestling with the questions of life, making his contribution. And then in John 17, he says, "And now, Father, I'm returning to you back to the glory we enjoyed before the foundation of the world." So it's an amazing and inspiring hero's journey, an amazing story arc. But it is, in fact, the story of all of us. Jesus is there as our model, showing us not only a way to understand this life, but to put it in a much bigger context. And if that's the case, then you and I existed as aspects of source, aspects of the divine consciousness before we became individuals. And it's to that that we'll return. And the very first Christians understood that. They talked about going to the great repose after this life, which essentially means going back to God, going back to source, enriched with what we've learned on the journey and ready for the next thing.
Is it your opinion that because there's more of a push to have being Jesus God, you see this same character like in the character of Horus in the Egyptians, right? Would you echo that opinion?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you would find scholars who would argue that Jesus can't be an historical figure because everything he does and says just seems to be a repeat of Horus and Osiris. I don't take that view myself. I believe there was an historical Jesus.
I do too. Yeah.
Because I think the Jesus in the Gospels was so inconvenient to the powers that were at that time, it would be ridiculous to make him up. I mean, some of the things he said about feudalism and taxation and the money system, no one would invent that if they wanted a religion that would create nice, quiet, compliant Roman citizens. But the way his story is told is you can't tell it that way unless you know the Egyptian material like the back of your hand. You can't tell it that way unless you know Plato like the back of your hand. And there are elements in it that would suggest you might know beyond Plato, you might know more about Eastern thought that later became what we would recognize as Hindu documents, Buddhist documents. Hints of that in the telling as well. The people who wrote the Gospels were theologians, they were philosophers, they knew world thought, and typologies and tropes from a whole world of thought are sewn into the telling of the story of Jesus. And I think you can't really understand what the Gospel's about until you read them in that wider context. For instance, without that wider context, you get to the end, the original ending of the Gospel of Mark with the empty tomb, and you'll think, oh, there must be a bit missing. This is a funny ending. Read it in the context of Greek and Roman literature, and you'll realize that finishing with an empty tomb is a claim to divinity. And now it makes sense, because the beginning of the Gospel of Mark tells you that that's what the conclusion is going to be. So I find it incredibly enriching to read the Gospels in this bigger context and see that, yes, it's about Jesus's divinity, but the question is he divine in the same way as you and me, or in a way that's different? Is he more divine, or is he divine and more conscious of it?
I've been doing a lot of research on Thoth through watching Billy Carson, and I have to say that I think a key word to this is repent. I think you've talked about it before. I probably would not say the Greek word. It's metanoia. Am I saying that right?
Yes, metanoia is the noun. Metanoiete is a form of the verb.
And it means to change your mind.
Well, it's got two parts to it. Meta means beyond, and then noia is mind, or noiete is think. So those are the raw parts. So people can say it's change your mind, but meta doesn't mean change. It means beyond.
Beyond.
So in some ways saying go beyond the mind. So that can mean a couple of things. Go beyond what you currently think, he could be saying, or he could be saying go beyond thinking with just this.
So when Thoth was talking in the Pianbrin, I think, am I saying that correctly? He was talking about the word, and he used another word for this word, which should really be reason. So the reason is when we have the word, we can reason now that we have the truth, because and he called it evil, if I'm not misquoting this, and he said that our senses are is the evil inclination that we've been given by these bodies.
Well, yes, that's interesting. The sense is a sort of a diminution of our knowing. And so when you look at Hermetic thought, for instance, there are these wonderful deep words that describe a kind of knowing, ultimate knowing, download of cosmic information, knowing beyond the mind, intuitive knowing, knowing things as they really are. All those ideas are invested into these key Greek words, like the word nous, for instance, which repeats in languages around the world. So there's that knowing that is what Plato would say is a remembering of when we knew everything, when we were part of God, when we were just an aspect of source consciousness and knew everything that could be known. We come into this material life and it's a diminution of our knowing. Plato says we forget everything we knew before. And if you go to Mesoamerican thought, to the Popol Vuh of the Mayan tradition, there's a very graphic section there where they talk about our senses limiting our perceptual field. They talk about a time when our ancestors were better at far sight and future sight and telepathic connection than we are. And then something happened that reduced them to their 5 physical senses, so they can only see, feel, hear, smell, and touch things immediately around them. And for everything else, they'll be reliant on an authority to tell them what's what. And so I find it interesting that that thought is there in the Mayan tradition, and it's there in the Hermetic Thoth tradition as well, that we are limited by our senses, but there's this impulse to get beyond them, to know things as they really are. And the whole of the Hermetic tradition is about doing that, becoming more intelligent, more aware, more conscious. And that's why we would call Hermeticism an ascension tradition, which is learning to become more than we are, more conscious. And I think the ascension impulse is there in the Gospels as well. So when Jesus comes along in the Gospel of Matthew, and he says, and to use the root meanings of the words, he says in Matthew 4, this is the message he toured with for a year, go beyond the mind, for the powers and principles of the cosmos are available to you, ready to be engaged with. That's what that message really means. And so that's an invitation to go on a journey of ascension. And even though Christianity morphed in the space of 3.5 centuries into really a control mechanism, a religion of worship and obedience, that impulse to ascension, the appetite for it, the materials to equip it, that's a strand all through Christian history, all through Jewish history, through the history of every religion. So even while you go through periods where that religion might be very top down and very controlled, there are still these traditions that are about waking people up and enabling us to become more than we are. So that when we read a passage such as Jesus saying, "Everything you've seen me do, these and greater things shall you do," that is another invitation to say, no, keep exploring, keep pushing forward, because more is possible than you've yet discovered.
Seek me, you will find, right? Knock, the door will be open. And I think a lot of people aren't really doing that, but they believe the words of Jesus. But do they? Going to the idea that we can see that there's some loss of memory coming after another reincarnation. Okay. We don't remember, although we could have attributes of the soul. I don't know if you piggyback with that, but from what my research is showing me is that there's this tunnel. Do you think that this tunnel has anything to do with the mind loss or the memory that we come back?
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting question, Gregory. I haven't thought in those terms, so I might have to come back to that question another time.
No worries. I like to think deep like that because I believe, and I don't know where I got this from. I must have been a philosopher and I just remembered it. But I see and learn by deduction because we're not going to have the answers. But when we can look at different things, size them up and say, well, if all of this happened over here, what's the likelihood that it wouldn't be this case as well? That's the way I
Yes,
think.
so that's very good. That's a good way to think.
Excellent. So, one of the things that really spurred my interest was the false, possibly ideology that we have free will. Do we have free will, or do we have a will of choice? It seems to me from the different, and I've studied, not to boast, but probably hundreds of these near-death experiences. There were multiple stories of people, even one gentleman that knew very much like what we understand that he doesn't want to come back and he's prepared to when he dies, he's meeting these beings. My question is, as I put this up, is it possible that this is a trap? Because if we have free will, notice that everybody, when they come in after a death or something, there's like, well, you need to go back, but they don't even tell them what it's for. And it seems that in this particular scenario, the gentleman, he says, I'm not going back. I'm a sovereign being. And he states these things very clearly. And these beings were, okay, we get it. You're sovereign and we understand. And they didn't fight him, but they continued. And then once they knew that he was very steadfast in his understanding, because he knew what he needed to do, then they brought some other people. And these people weren't as nice. And they said, well, no, you need to do this. This is what you need to do. And, it wasn't the love. It was more like, no, you don't have this choice. You need to go back. And he still held his position. You know what they did? From the story, they said, well, we have 3 doors here. You choose. What I have researched is that they only can do this if you give them permission. Well, guess what? When you choose, you're going right back. And that's what he ended up back to Earth.
Well, that's a very interesting story. And it is similar and different to a lot of stories I've heard from people who've had near-death experiences where they feel there was some kind of a life review, and then there was some kind of a decision to be made as to whether to go on to the next thing or to have another go around here. And that thinking is there in Plato as well. And Plato is a little bit more positive about the guides that we experience in our death state, the guides who do our life review, the guides who help us think through what to do next. And it was in Plato that I first came across that idea. And it took me back to the New Testament to realize that some of the texts that I'd read as heaven and hell texts are not really heaven and hell texts at all. They are life review texts. I think if we're asking the question about free will, you have to ask it at a couple of levels. So there's the life that we're all conscious of here, that we're living from day to day, where we would appear to be exercising free will from day to day. And that would, in fact, appear to be part of the meaning of our lives, that we're learning to make good choices because we understand in this world of cause and effect that choices have consequences. And so the exercise of choice is a very important part of our life journey. But what if we are beings of consciousness before we have this material experience? What does it mean for us to exercise free will before we come into this life? And there are a lot of people who have near-death experiences who describe conversations similar to your friends, where they are, in essence, agreeing on a particular role in this life. So that's not necessarily agreeing on a course of events that are all preordained, but more a role. I'm going in as the helper. I'm going in as the teacher. I'm going in as the one who will bring patience into the scenario. It's that kind of thought, so that people can become aware of this in this life without a near-death experience. If you've just had the third rather similar crisis in your life, or the third rather similar trauma, that might be enough to stop you in your tracks and think, wait a minute, what is going on here? Why are these patterns repeating? What am I bringing to them? Am I making these things happen? Or is it just bad luck? Or is it that I need to nail the response to this and find a better way to handle this? Or is it simply these things happen because I know how to handle them and I am being myself when I handle them? These are all the kinds of questions that can occur simply through observing your own life, if you live long enough to get that kind of reflection in. And they suggest to me that we do have some kind of a say in what we're coming here for, or what we're coming back for, what our role is. And often in coaching, if I'm dealing with somebody who is going through a transition or trying to get their head around a sense of life purpose, I'll often ask that question: what do you think your role is? If you picture your life as a stage play, what's your role? Are you the protagonist or the antagonist? Are you the comic relief? Are you the narrator? And very often people will have a very quick answer. And then that will get them into saying, actually, I always play this role in my relationships. People say this about me. And once you get a handle on your life that way, I think it can bring a certain confidence, courage, and playfulness to what we're doing here. And I find that a more helpful way of coming to terms with signs that all is not free, that there are certain things that seem to be set or decided, because then you realize, oh, okay, there's a game for me to play here. There are things for me to learn here. There's a role for me to perform here. Whereas without that framework, you start talking about determinism, and it becomes so depressing, because the message of determinism is that your choices are irrelevant. You know, what you think or want is irrelevant because it's all foreordained. And I don't think that's the case at all. We are here to exercise our will, our choice, but we might just recognize some patterns that tell us there's another layer to this story too.
Excellent. And if it was part of a trap, if it was, right? And that's always I would like to say it. I would like to say it could be this, it could be this. Let the people make their decision, right? Just like we have our thoughts. You've heard of the spiritual energy loosh, right? I find it very interesting because, as you know, the powers to be, which I believe are ultimately the higher up, which would be the Anunnaki, are teaching these powers to be, who might be filmmakers, directors, to do these things, or they could even be those people themselves. They put out some interesting movies. The 13th Ladder, Groundhog Day, The Truman Show, and The Matrix is probably the most understood. And the basis was that that there is spiritual energy, which is called loosh, that is being harvested. Your thoughts on this? Are we getting this in our face because they say the truth's right in front of you and people don't see it? This is something they need to do, by the way, which I firmly believe. And I think that when I saw The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, I just saw it a couple of days ago with my wife. If I saw that movie, I would be like, I would probably figure it out, okay? But now that I have this knowledge that I understand, I found it very interesting that these beings who are doing this, all these cameras around the table, right? They're on the moon. I know Zachariah Sitchin talked about, these beings being on the moon. Can you comment on that? Is this something that is just a coincidence, or are they trying to tell us something?
Oh gosh, there are so many layers to that question. I think there's so much out there in film lore that is worth paying attention to. People who write screenplays, first off, let's remember they are writers, so they are interested in literature. And they will often be bringing ancient ideas from ancient texts and re-expressing them in modern terms. And so for that reason, you will have very profound esoteric thought in mainstream movies. But writers are creative people as well. And sometimes I think writers can channel higher information without realizing that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that was the case with the movie The Matrix, because if you listen to the two creators of the Matrix canon, they would tell you it's about one thing. And you and I would say, oh, but I thought it was all about holographic universe.
Yeah.
And it can be both. They had their intent, they had their topic that they wanted to explore. But when you are a creative and you're in the creative flow, you can download higher information without realizing that's what's going on. And then another reason you can get very interesting material in movies is because of privileged information. So through conscious contact or through contact with literature that has emanated from contact with higher beings. And so you can find examples of that in The Outer Limits, Stargate, Star Trek, Star Wars, that kind of literature, that kind of film. So, I mean, I find, for instance, the Marvel universe absolutely fascinating, and I take my hat off to the writers there, who I think are very consciously sowing Greek thought, Roman thought, Platonic thought into that canon of movies, so that when people come to Thoth or Plato, having watched the Marvel universe movies, they'll say, hang on, I'm familiar with all these ideas. So
Sure.
I love that, and I applaud all that. But there was another layer to the question. Now, let me see where you got to at the end of your question. You were asking about soul harvesting. That's right.
Yeah.
I find the literature of the Gnostics very interesting in this regard, and it overlaps to some extent with some of the jinn stories of Muslim Arabic traditions. The Gnostics, I should just add, people think they know what that word means, and it's often been used pejoratively in the world of Christian theology. It really was just a word used to describe very early Christians. And so someone like Clement of Alexandria, when he talks about the true Gnostic, he's not talking about something outside of Christianity. That's his language for the true believer. But we use the word Gnostic to describe literature that didn't make it into the canon, which is a little bit anachronistic.
Right.
So if we park that word and say, go to the very early Christian literature, and you've got this idea of archons being described. And an archon, we could say, is an energy-based being that derives its energy as a parasite, parasiting off the emotional energy of organic life like you and me. And just like a parasite or a virus, their expertise is making us ill emotionally. So they will manipulate us into more what Plato would call the heavier emotions, rage, anger, fury, despair, trauma. And once they've got us in that headspace, they then feed off all that lovely negative energy. That's the Archon story. And so I think we need to be very conscious of our emotional state, whether we see it as the work of algorithms or the work of elites or the work of archons. Whichever way you view it, whether you take it literally or figuratively, the take home is the same. Be very intentional about your emotional state. Don't let yourself get pulled into rage, exasperation, fear, all those things. Check yourself before you slip into those states, because you'll get into a vicious circle.
Yeah.
Be intentional about maintaining a higher energy, keeping yourself mentally clear, do whatever you need to do to keep yourself in a good equilibrium and feeling okay. And let's do that for one another as well. Because I think you've only got to spend time around the TV news or around algorithms and social media to know what happens when you don't do that. We get ourselves into a very polarized social situation. We become very isolated, and emotionally, we're not doing so well. You've only got to talk to the world's taxi drivers to know that the general public are not as well as they were a few years ago in their emotional and mental state. The taxi driver can take the temperature of the person in their car instinctively. I mean, they know to do that, to know whether to be quiet, have a conversation, whether the person is safe or unsafe. And I find, talking to taxi drivers, they all say the same thing. The last few years, everyone's fallen down a peg or two in terms of their mental health. And I think that's partly because of what we've been fed through mainstream media and social media. And the Archon stories is a great education in not letting that happen and choosing your emotional and mental state so that you can have a better experience of life.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think from what I also have found is that if you go back to the Atlantis story, the Atlanteans, which, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is when the Anunnaki came there, they caused a lot of problems. And we see these towers, very similar to the 5G towers that we see all around. I found that very interesting with the subtle twisting of frequencies, which we see also in music. Back in the 40s and 50s, we didn't have this I think it's 442. They changed the frequency, and it literally changes people's thoughts. Am I correct on that?
Yes, I think the frequencies that are broadcast to us are very significant to our mental and emotional state. People become aware of this when they start using sound for healing. And they find, oh, there are these healthy frequencies that our bodies respond to really positively. And then here are these less healthy frequencies. And oh my goodness, that's actually been sewn into this and into this. I said to a friend the other day, talking about the culture of violence that is endemic to the American experience right now, and the experience of polarization, which is very extreme in the United States of America right now. How do you explain it? And I said to a friend the other day, I love my American brothers and sisters. I find Americans to be wonderful people. But if somebody told me that for the last 30 years, someone's been broadcasting frequencies over the United States of America to make people more anxious and more aggressive, I would have no difficulty believing that at all, because of how we've seen social behavior change. What can you do about it? I think, again, just be very intentional about the vibrations and sounds you surround yourself with at home. Some people are very onto this already, and they will be choosing music or music that's based on particular frequencies to create an environment in their home just to cancel out the soup of noise and the unhelpful frequencies you might be encountering in other places. And I think that's something that all of us would probably do well to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you believe the Anunnaki is here right now? I've done some research on both ends, and I guess my question would be that we know the government has put out by companies like Lockheed Martin. I believe that they have been doing some reverse engineering What is your thought? Are they coming from another planet, or are they already here being reverse engineered, or both?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Haim Eshed, the Brigadier General, who for 28 years was Israel's Chief of Space Security, talked about, this was Christmas 2020, talked about the program, as it's known in the Pentagon, extending back more than 70 years, and that it's not just we've got artifacts that we're working on, it's actually part of a program of collaboration. So that suggests, yes, there are presences here. Haymashed also said there is an adjacent presence, which we could call the Galactic Federation, which is a collection of spacefaring civilizations who feel they have an interest in planet Earth. And when Haymashed uses that language, he's only echoing the biblical language of the El Ba'adat, the Council of Powers, or the Sky Council that you'll encounter in Norse legend, Greek legend, Indian legend, so on and so forth. So I would say, yes, there are presences. Yes, there's collaboration that's happening because we are in relationship with some of these presences. As to whether they include the historic Anunnakis, so beings like Enlil and Enki, such as we read about in the Sumerian, I'm not sure. I would suggest that there are more demographics here with a hands-on involvement in Project Earth than was the case tens of thousands of years ago in the stories related by the ancient Mesopotamian cultures. This is just me reflecting on those stories where there seems to be a fairly clean storyline of who's running the show, whether you're reading the Sumerian or the Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian, or Hebrew versions of the story. I think things have got more complex. I think more involved now. I think there are more demographics on the Galactic Federation now than there were 10,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago. So even if that same demographic of the ancient Anunnaki are here, it's not quite the same game as it was back in the days of Enlil and Enki. That's my take.
Yeah, it's very interesting. For the viewers who are not aware, Enki was a scientist, and Lil was his half brother, and it's very interesting because if you look at the story, I know Paul always says that the Bible is not really about God; it's about the Anunnaki story, and so it mirrors almost the blessing and the birthright of Jacob and Esau. Your thought?
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating story. When we read the Bible, we tend to read it as if we're reading a sequential story. Once you read it slowly enough from the beginning of Genesis, it emerges you're reading a sequence of stories of beginnings that have just been layered side by side. So by the time, for instance, you get to Genesis 11, I reckon you've read between 3 or 5 planetary resets. And there's a story of beginnings associated with each of those. You get to Genesis 12 and you might think, we're now out of the story of beginnings. We're into the story of history as we know it. Except when you get to Jacob and Esau, we've got 2 different kinds of human being, very clearly described. You read it sequentially, and that's far too late in the story. Except, go back 2 generations, Abraham and Sarah, Genesis 12, those names ought to ring a bell again as soon as you stop reading the Bible in a bubble and read world literature. Brahma and Saraswati, those names sound rather similar, and in the Vedic tradition, the Hindu tradition, Brahma and Saraswati are the progenitors of the many nations. Oops, that phrase sounds familiar. Abraham, the father of many nations. So I think that layered into the Abraham and Sarah story, I think there are a number of layers, but one of the layers is it's a story of human origins, that they are the progenitors of the many nations, not just many. And in fact, they only produced 2 nations, strictly speaking, reading the Bible as it is in its latest redaction. But if that's a human origin story, And it begins with interaction with non-human entities, remember. 2 generations later, we've got 2 different kinds of human being. Smooth-skinned, intelligent, that's us. And then much bigger, stronger, covered in hair, so dense that it could be confused with the hair of a goat, and that can be manipulated with offerings of food. Well, isn't that how we domesticate animals? Through offerings of food? And I think it's that kind of story we've got in Jacob and Esau. I think it's a human origin story right there that we're looking at.
Yeah. And there's many too, with Noah and Moses and
there are so many. And I think it evokes a memory of the time when we shared our environment with other types of human or other human-like beings, and we had to work out how to get the upper hand. I think that is the primal layer of the Jacob and Esau story.
If there was and again, like you said, you and I believe there was a Jesus or Yeshua, his Hebrew name. Was there a connection? Because every time we see El, he was said, "This is Emmanuel." Is this a connection to the Elohim?
Well, El becomes a word that simply means power, or powers, or powerful one. And so the name Emmanuel is the powerful one with us, which is a wonderful name to give any person, and
Right.
certainly a very prophetic name to give Jesus. But Jesus didn't affirm the Elohim or Yahweh stories as stories to be read at face value as God's stories. In fact, I argue in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, that Jesus distanced himself from the Yahweh character, that the Gospels present him almost as a counterpart to the Yahweh character, that his name, which comprises 2 word parts, salvation and Yahweh, might not mean salvation by Yahweh, it might mean salvation from Yahweh. And certainly it's very clear by the end of the Gospels that Jesus is not a Yahwist. He's not teaching Yahwist law. And this is clarified for us when we get to Acts 15, when the apostolic leaders of the primitive church make a ruling that says Christianity is not going to be built on Yahwism. You don't have to have faith in or obedience to the Yahwist laws to be a Christian. That's all been dispensed with for Christianity moving forward. Now, there is no way the apostolic leaders could have made that decision unless it became clear to them that Jesus was not a Yahwist. If they regarded Jesus as having faith in or obedience to Yahwism, Christianity would have to be Yahwism too. And they made the opposite decision. So once you've read Acts 15, you have to go back and realize that we're reading a story of discontinuity between Yahwism and what Jesus was on about. And when you look back through that lens, it becomes crystal clear. Yahweh said this, but I say this. You've heard it said, I say this. Moses permitted this, but I say this.
Yes.
Jesus is being presented as a discontinuation and as a counterpart teacher. And once you realize it's a story of discontinuity, it becomes crystal clear and you can see it everywhere. But we've been confused, I think, for 2,000 years by the fact that the Yahweh stories have been glued on to the apostolic stories of Jesus. And we assume that it's a story of the same God from start to finish. Whereas in fact, the Hebrew scriptures are the Jewish memory of a cocktail of experiences and theologies and ideas. And many of those experiences were experiences of paleo contact.
You mentioned that we are right now explaining to people that there's a battle. I do believe there's a battle between, like, if you have the Confederation of Light, who are the good guys, and then you have, or some people call them the white hats, then you have also the black hats, or you have the Anunnaki, in my position, as I'm understanding this, is they're fighting amongst each other to decide what they're going to do with the humans. One part wants to wipe us out completely, do a wipe and reboot. This is not uncommon. We saw this happen with the Neanderthals, right? And they went to the Cro-Magnon. Could this happen again? To me, it sounds like this is what they want to do. However, it does also look like when you have like the Star Seeds Galactic Federation, that they are fighting with the humans. And there is a lady, I don't know if you're familiar with her, Elena Danan. She is stating that she actually goes into the crafts with Enki. She's very well known. Sasha Stone had her on one time. Is there any legitimacy to this? Could this happen?
Well, when we read the biblical stories of the Sky Council, or the Mesopotamian, or the Vedic, or the Nordic stories, the advanced beings are always conflicting over Project Earth. And I think we can see reflected a variety of agendas among the advanced beings who came in the past. So you've got stories that suggest we had visitors who were here for the minerals, and our ancestors were useful because they could help us mine the minerals. And then there are abduction and hybridization narratives all around the world that suggest that some are here because of us, because they like what we have and they want more of what we've got in their gene pool. So you've got that kind of agenda. And then you've got hints in many of the stories of the wars in the heavens that some are here simply for strategic advantage, in the same way that we might occupy somebody else's country because it means we can launch missiles from there to someone else's country. There may be factions who just want control, to be able to manage this quadrant of the universe, and that's why we're here. And so for some, we're in irrelevance. For some, we are a resource. And for some, we might be a workforce. So that's three agendas right then and there, all reflected in the world's ancestral stories about contact. And so I think part of what happens on the Galactic Federation, Sky Council, El Ba'adat, the Council of Powers, is these interests have to jostle against one another and come to some kind of stable agreement as to how Project Earth is going to be managed. And I am reassured by the stability of this arrangement that any who are saying, oh, just get rid of the humans because they're really an inconvenience, are held at bay by plenty of other factions who are saying, don't you dare, that's no way to behave. And lots of ancestral stories suggest that we have factions like that from the Pleiades, for instance, from Sirius, who have every capability to defend our corner and say, no, actually, we're not going to have any more global floods or anything quite like that, because the humans are valuable. In fact, we think they're amazing.
And wasn't that one of the reasons that Enlil was very mad with Enki, because he didn't want to deal with the humans at all? And it is galactic law that they do have to nurture us after we're created.
Yes, that's right. So in the Sumerian story of Enlil and Enki, Enlil is he's the younger brother, and he is the commander of this region of space, which means strategic advantage is all he's really thinking. His older brother Enki is responsible for Project Earth, and he's been responsible for adapting our ancestors and genetically modifying our ancestors to become Homo sapiens sapiens. And he forms an attachment for Project Humanity. And so when Enlil says, it'd be far better if we just get rid of the humans, Enki says, no, don't you dare. But Enlil forces the decision through on the council, and Enki has to come up with a rescue package to make sure planet Earth can be reseeded. That's the Noah story, or Zisudra, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, a story that echoes all around the world. So that one story exemplifies the kind of tussle that happens, I think, throughout the ages around how many human beings should there be on planet Earth, and how intelligent should they be, how much access to information should they have, how healthy, how long lived. These, I think, are the perpetual conflicts of those who govern Project Humanity, and it's totemized in that story of Enlil and Enki.
Excellent. And I want to touch on your latest book. It is The Eden Conspiracy. Where can we get this book?
If you go to Amazon and Kindle, that's the place that you'll find The Eden Conspiracy. I'm really excited about this particular book because I really show my working in it, and I show how the Bible itself tells us how the narrative was changed from a narrative of paleo-contact to a narrative of worship and obedience and Yahwist monotheism. It's not just me who's come up with this theory that the narrative was changed. The books of Jeremiah and 2 Kings and Ezra tell us it was changed, how it was changed, who changed it, when and why.
It's just a phenomenal book, people. You need to get this. People by the likes of Eric Van Donken, I know George Norrie, Coast to Coast, speaking highly of this book. You definitely want to pick this up. Paul Wallis's latest book, The Eden Conspiracy. I do have one final question. Is there anything else you would want to share about the book before the question?
No, I just think if you're wanting one book to summarize the Eden series so far, get hold of The Eden Conspiracy. If you're looking for a book to leave lying around the house to convince any skeptics, The Eden Conspiracy is the one to do that, because I really show the working.
Excellent. And that's the latest book. The final question I have, Paul, is through people in religion, this is a very tough question to answer, so I don't want to take you by surprise, but you probably have heard this before, but let's talk about it real quick. Christianity, if it's not in the Bible, everything's demonic. It's demonic, it's Satan. We have that, and it's okay. We all grow out of that when we start to search, right? But what I'm having a really, not tough time understanding, but where does this fit in? There are people who are meeting Jesus, meeting angels. I know there's probably a lot of people out there who say, well, I'm a good person. I'm in meditation. How come I'm not having these occurrences? And is it your thought? Is this really Jesus or Christ that's coming to these people, or could these be negative portholes, or what I like to call them negs, confusing and misleading people? Because I do believe that the Anunnaki set up religion. I don't know if you would attune to that, to cause division. And that's why we have so many thousands of denominations. Nobody's really on that same path. And I believe possibly this is why Jesus said that the path is narrow and few find it. Not that we're going to go into some destruction, into utter hell for eternity, but that possibly if we don't find what we're looking for, there may be another time that we'll get a chance to find that. In other words, it's not going to just happen in one life. Are these the rouses of demonic things happening? Or, for example, if somebody is in Islam, they're getting messages to say, come to follow Jesus, follow. Is it at that point that they need to start going further, or is this could be just a wake-up call for them to get out of their religion? Is all religion bad, and does it? Is there some, in your opinion, is there some truth to coexisting and getting along with everybody versus some agenda that all religions have?
Wow. Well, that was a sequence of really deep questions. I think you can go to any religious tradition and you will find there is a mystical expression of that religion. And when you get talking to the mystics, you'll find they're not disagreeing with each other. They're not in fights with one another. They are all describing the same kind of phenomena. And it goes back to that kind of intuitive knowing, the downloading of divine information that we were talking before when we described Hermeticism and ascension traditions. So I think what I find really exciting looking at the world's family of religions is that you get into the mystical layer and you get way beyond all the denominational fighting about who's right and who's wrong. And suddenly we are human beings having ascension experiences and able to compare notes on them. So I was absolutely fascinated, for instance, to read of dialogues between Zen Buddhists, people like Meister Eckhart, Thomas Merton, all finding similar experiences and interpretations from them. So there's that layer. And so I don't write religion off, because religions are full of all kinds of people, and some of those people are seekers, and some of them are truth seekers. And it can be difficult being in a community of faith when you're a truth seeker, because you'll be satisfied with the answers for some time, and then you'll just have to bust beyond the local conclusions because they haven't scratched every itch. There's something more going on here. And so when you're a truth seeker, it can take you beyond the confines of a particular faith into the mystical territory where we start finding each other afresh. I find it very easy to connect with other people who are truth seekers, whatever their religious start point is, because we are all on a journey of discovery. And I think, as you hinted, Gregory, early on, many of us have quite simplified worldviews where we've got just a few boxes that the whole of reality has to fix in. And I was a bit like that as a young believer. There was God, the devil, angels, demons, animal, vegetable, mineral, and nothing else. And so when I had some experiences at the age of 20 that were close encounters with non-human visitors, the experience that was scary, I thought, well, that must be a demonic encounter. The experience that was uplifting, I thought, well, that must be an angelic encounter. And it was only when I did my formal theology and took my more developed thought back to those experiences that I realized, no, that doesn't fit. What I experienced, that's not how demons are described in Christianity or any other religious tradition I know. What I experienced there, that's not an angelic experience. That's something else. And so bit by bit, you realize you need far more boxes. Or maybe just forget about the boxes and try and describe the experience you had. And again, another reason I don't want to dismiss religion is because in every religion, people are having profound, wonderful, life-changing experiences because they're seeking. And to use a Christian example, I could meet a lot of people who would have a life-transforming experience, and they might start off by saying, oh, my life changed when I met Jesus. And I'll say, well, tell me about that when you met Jesus. Because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I don't think you encountered a flesh and blood human being. So what did you encounter?
Right.
And very often they will describe an experience of unconditional love, of a complete feeling of freedom and confidence and security. And that's what transformed them. And it unlocked their emotions, it unlocked their imagination, and it may have healed them of trapped emotion, may have healed them of physical things. But when they get down to describing, well, an experience of love, it was an experience of light and freedom, then you begin to realize, well, this is actually an ascension experience that they experienced in the church. This person experienced on the top of a mountain. This person experienced with a shaman in the jungles of Amazonia. And you begin to realize these are human experiences of people who are on a journey of discovery and ascension. So I try not to be too dismissive of religion, even though institutional religion, I think, has been absolutely appalling. There's a pretty negative story. People within the religions may be wonderful, genuine truth seekers who are having really powerful experiences, who then become the mystics of this generation.
So when you had this experience, Paul, what is in your mind? Why did they pick Paul Wallis? I mean, do you have any? Because I understand Billy Carson's background with his. Did you have any previous like family members or anything that had also experienced this that would lead you to believe that you also would have these experiences? And then one last quick question.
Yeah.
What is the born again? What did Jesus mean when he said you must be born again? This is like a page that everybody will tell you in Christianity. They have their different thoughts. What is your thought?
Well, that's a great set of questions. When I had my experiences at the age of 20, I had no idea that anyone in my family had had experiences like this before. And it's only in recent years that I've discovered that others in my family have had this kind of experience. So I was absolutely on my own when I had the experience. But I think they're really common. I mean, you say, why did they pick Paul Wallis? I think millions and billions of us are having weird experiences that we can't quite explain. And if we all sat down and compared notes, we'd realize a lot of these experiences are contact phenomena. Why me? Well, I was living on my own. I was living near a Ministry of Defense base. That's probably reason enough to be picked for a visit. So there's that. The born again is a wonderful question. I, for a long time, read that text as if Jesus had used the words, become a Christian. You must become a Christian. And of course, those words are not there in the text at all. Right. He's saying you must be born from above, which now sounds a little bit more like an activation if you stick to those words, born from above. Born of the water and the spirit, well, that's ancient language for water means this material realm. So we have this material birth, which Jesus unpacks, and then something else must happen, some kind of an activation. And I think that this relates to human experience that goes beyond becoming a Christian, a phrase that Jesus never uses. And this began to confront me when, for instance, I was listening to the life story of Eve Ensler, who is a phenomenal cultural and thought leader in the area of the emancipation of women around the world. And she describes this experience where she had published a book and she had toured with it as a sort of one-woman show, but it was a really quite serious lecture that she was giving. And at the end of every lecture, there'd be a line of women coming to her and sharing their stories of misogyny and abuse and persecution, according to where she was speaking. And at some point, this became overwhelming to her. And she couldn't carry that pain anymore. She had her own trauma. She couldn't carry, thousands of other people's trauma. And she collapsed on the floor of a bus station, I think it was. And she just cried out to the universe, to God. She wasn't a believer. I can't do this. I cannot go on any longer. You have to help me. And in that moment, she describes this change in her mind, in her emotions, in her body, in her life that was just like a complete relaunch of who she was. And from that moment on, her capacity to love and care for others, went from here to here. And as I listened to her experience and the shape of her life since, I thought, that's a born again experience. Nowhere does she use the language of becoming a Christian. And I don't think she did, but I couldn't mistake it. I've had a born again experience myself. I know thousands of people have known thousands of people through the years who describe it that way from within the Christian frame. Now I realize this is a much bigger phenomenon that Jesus was talking about. And it has to do, again, with ascension, with activation. And it's not about your life changing because you can suddenly recite 5 fundamental theological doctrines. It's something far more profound and universal than that.
As the absolute, as the pure divinity and the source of all things, right? In your opinion, is this source listening, or is what we're seeing, like even what you explained with the lady, do you think that has something to do with the Elohim, since this is their earth?
Is the source listening? I think short answer, yes.
Okay.
I think once you start unpacking what source means, understanding God as source, it means that if we're intelligent, there's intelligence in the source. If we're conscious, then there's consciousness in the source. If we can become aware of our own thought, then the source certainly can. And certainly my pattern of prayer has changed as I've gone on this journey into the realm of paleo contact. But I find if I put questions to the source, to the universe, to God, to my team, that answers come back. And that, when Paul said we are all offspring of the source, it means that my intelligence is a participation in source intelligence. So I should expect to think divine thoughts and recognize them as such from time to time. So when I pray, yes, I do pray as if I'm being listened to.
Mhm.
And the responses I get suggest, yes, there is intelligence, there's love, there's concern, there's support that comes back when I do that.
And right after I said that, immediately into my spirit, I was directed to a study that was part of the near-death experiences. And what people described is when they were up above and looking, they could see every single individual soul. It was not anybody they couldn't see, and that tells us the connection
Yes,
through
exactly.
his eyes. This is the way, right? That's the way I see it.
Exactly.
So fantastic interview today, Paul. I hope we can get another one sometime.
For sure.
And it's just, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Wallis. Thank you, Paul, for being here. We really appreciate it. And you've helped our channel quite a bit, by the way, and we're forever grateful. Don't
Oh,
forget
wonderful.
Paul Wallis's book, The Eden Conspiracy.
And come and meet me at fifthkind.tv. You can find The Fifth Kind on YouTube and the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube as well.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, with that being said, for the House of Light, my name is Gregory Mitchem with Paul Wallis in Australia. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye now.